In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Willow Ridge, life was supposed to be peaceful. Neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles during morning walks. Kids rode their bikes on sunny afternoons, and everything seemed picture-perfect. But beneath this serene surface, a simmering tension brewed between two residents, Jake Harper and Karen Wexler. At the heart of their feud was something surprisingly mundane yet infuriating: a parking spot. Jake Harper had lived in Willow Ridge for 5 years. He loved his little corner of the world, where evenings were spent tinkering in his garage or relaxing on his porch with a cup of coffee. His designated parking spot, conveniently located near his unit, made coming home after a long day at work just a little easier. It wasn't extravagant, but it was his, clearly marked as part of the homeowners association rules. Or so he thought. Enter Karen Wexler, the self-proclaimed queen bee of the neighborhood. Known affectionately, or mockingly, as Hey Hoa Karen, she prided herself on enforcing every rule in the book, no matter how trivial. From policing mailbox colors to reporting recycling bin violations, Karen ruled the cul-de-sac with an iron fist wrapped in garden gloves. But there was one rule Karen conveniently ignored: parking etiquette. Every single evening, without fail, Jake would pull into the driveway only to find Karen's shiny silver SUV parked squarely in his spot. No note, no apology, just her car sitting there as if it belonged. The first time it happened, Jake assumed it was a simple mistake. He knocked on Karen's door, politely explaining that the space was reserved for him. She nodded absently, muttered something about needing it temporarily, and promised not to do it again. But promises meant nothing to Karen. The very next day, her SUV reappeared like clockwork. Frustrated but determined to keep the peace, Jake tried leaving polite reminders on her windshield. "This is my assigned spot," read one sticky note. Another said, "Please respect the HOA guidelines." Each message went unanswered. Instead, Karen doubled down, even going so far as to tell other neighbors that Jake was being dramatic about a silly parking issue. When niceties failed, Jake escalated the matter to the HOA board. Meetings were held, emails exchanged, and formal complaints filed. Yet somehow, Karen always managed to wiggle out of accountability. She argued that her arthritis made walking farther inconvenient, dismissing Jake's concerns with a dismissive flick of her wrist. To make matters worse, some board members sympathized with her, citing her years of service to the community. Jake felt defeated, stuck in a loop of frustration with no resolution in sight. The situation grew increasingly absurd. On weekends, when Jake wanted to spend time gardening or working on projects, he'd circle the block endlessly looking for an open space. Sometimes, he resorted to parking blocks away and lugging groceries back under the scorching sun. Meanwhile, Karen acted as though nothing was amiss, strolling past him with a smug smile while humming show tunes. It wasn't just about convenience anymore, it was about principle. Jake couldn't understand why someone who preached following the rules refused to follow them herself. As days turned into weeks, Jake's patience wore thin. What started as a minor annoyance became a daily battle of wills. Every sighting of Karen's SUV in his spot fueled his anger, chipping away at the tranquility he once cherished. Something had to give, and soon. Little did Karen know, Jake was about to take matters into his own hands in a way neither she nor anyone else in Willow Ridge would ever see coming. Jake's breaking point came on a cold, rainy Thursday evening. He had spent the entire day troubleshooting server issues at work, his mind racing between lines of code and client demands. By the time he left the office, all he wanted was to get home, change into comfortable clothes, and collapse onto his couch with a hot meal. But fate, and Karen, had other plans. As Jake turned onto his street, he immediately noticed something amiss. His parking spot, as usual, was occupied by Karen's silver SUV. This wasn't unusual, but what made matters worse was the way she had parked. Her vehicle wasn't just in his space. It was angled awkwardly, spilling slightly into the shared driveway that connected their units. The positioning blocked access to the narrow path used for deliveries and trash pickups. Jake groaned aloud, gripping the steering wheel tightly. It was bad enough that she stole his spot daily, but now she was making life difficult for everyone else in the neighborhood. He pulled over to the curb and sat in his car for a moment, staring at the scene before him. Raindrops pattered against the windshield as frustration bubbled inside him. How could someone be so inconsiderate? He thought back to all the times he'd tried reasoning with her, calm conversations, polite notes, even involving the HOA, and nothing had worked. Each attempt felt like shouting into a void, met with indifference or outright defiance. Karen didn't care about fairness or rules unless they served her interests. With no other option, Jake began circling the block, searching for an open space. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the streets glistened under the dim glow of streetlights. Every lot he passed was full, forcing him to drive farther and farther from home. By the time he finally found a spot, it was 3 blocks away. Wet, exhausted, and seething, Jake grabbed his laptop bag and umbrella and trudged through the downpour. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just because of the weather, but because of the weight of his growing resentment. When he finally reached his front door, dripping wet and shivering, Jake couldn't shake the image of Karen's SUV sitting smugly in his spot. He glanced out the window, half expecting to see her lounging comfortably inside her house, oblivious to the chaos she caused. For the first time, he allowed himself to entertain thoughts of retaliation, not violent or malicious, but clever. There had to be a way to level the playing field, to make Karen understand the consequences of her actions. The idea came to him later that night as he scrolled through social media while nursing a cup of tea. A post about neighborhood disputes caught his eye, featuring a story about a woman who painted her driveway with no parking signs after years of dealing with similar issues. Jake chuckled at first, thinking it was a bit extreme. But then, as he stared at the photo of the freshly painted asphalt, something clicked. What if he could turn his parking spot into a restricted area? If it were officially designated for emergencies only, Karen wouldn't dare park there, or risk facing real consequences. The more Jake thought about it, the more appealing the plan became. He imagined the look on Karen's face when she realized her days of hogging his space were over. For once, she'd be the one inconvenienced, forced to deal with the fallout of her own selfish behavior. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control and sending a clear message that enough was enough. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. He knew executing the plan wouldn't be easy. It would require research, preparation, and maybe even a little courage. But for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start laying the groundwork for his bold move. And Karen, she had no idea what was coming her way. The next morning, Jake woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. The idea that had taken root in his mind the night before was now growing into a full-fledged plan. As sunlight streamed through his bedroom window, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened his laptop. His mission for the day was clear: figure out how to make his parking spot untouchable, and legally so. Jake's first step was research. He started by looking up local ordinances related to fire lanes and no parking zones. After hours of scrolling through municipal websites and reading dense legal jargon, he finally found what he needed. According to city regulations, any area designated as a fire lane required specific markings, including bold lettering and reflective materials, to ensure visibility. Unauthorized vehicles parked in these areas could be towed immediately without warning. It sounded perfect, exactly the kind of enforcement Karen wouldn't dare challenge. But Jake knew he couldn't just slap some paint on the pavement and call it a day. To avoid trouble, he needed official approval. So he picked up the phone and dialed the city planning department. A friendly representative answered, and Jake explained his situation carefully, framing it as a safety measure rather than a personal vendetta. "I want to designate my parking space as a fire lane to improve emergency access," he said, keeping his tone professional. After answering a few questions about the location and dimensions of the space, the representative confirmed that Jake could proceed, as long as he followed the proper guidelines. With permission secured, Jake moved on to the logistics. He visited a local hardware store to gather supplies: bright red spray paint, stencils spelling out "Fire Lane," "No Parking," and rolls of reflective tape. He even splurged on a set of orange traffic cones to block off the area while he worked. By the time he returned home, his trunk was loaded with everything he needed to transform his parking spot into an official no-go zone. That evening, after most neighbors had retreated indoors for dinner, Jake got to work. Armed with his supplies and a flashlight, he stepped outside and began preparing the space. First, he swept away debris and wiped down the asphalt to ensure the paint would adhere properly. Then, using masking tape, he outlined where the letters would go, making sure they were straight and evenly spaced. Finally, he sprayed the words "Fire Lane" in bold, capital letters across the pavement, adding arrows pointing toward the curb for extra emphasis. As he worked, Jake couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was uncharted territory for him. Normally, he preferred to stay out of drama and keep things low-key. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for himself and setting boundaries. Still, he wondered how Karen would react when she saw the changes. Would she try to fight back? Or would she finally realize she pushed too far? Once the painting was complete, Jake applied strips of reflective tape along the edges of the fire lane markings, ensuring they'd catch the light at night. He placed the orange cones around the perimeter, creating a temporary barrier until the paint dried. Stepping back to admire his handiwork, Jake felt a surge of satisfaction. His once contested parking spot now looked official, authoritative, and impossible to ignore. Before heading inside, Jake snapped a quick photo of the freshly painted fire lane with his phone. He sent it to a close friend who had been following the saga, captioning it simply, "Phase 1 complete." Within minutes, his friend replied with a laughing emoji and a thumbs up. For the first time in months, Jake went to bed feeling hopeful, not just about reclaiming his space, but about proving that sometimes justice can be served with a little creativity and determination. And tomorrow, Karen would get her first taste of what he had in store. The next morning, Jake woke up earlier than usual, his nerves buzzing with anticipation. He peeked out of his window to check the parking spot, now boldly marked as a fire lane. The red letters gleamed in the soft morning sunlight, and the reflective tape sparkled like a silent warning to anyone who dared park there. It looked official, almost too good. For a moment, he worried that Karen might see through his plan or call him out for overstepping. But then he reminded himself, everything he had done was legal, approved, and within the rules. If anything, this was her wake-up call. As the day unfolded, Jake kept an eye on the clock, waiting for Karen's inevitable return. She usually got home around 5:30 p.m. after her weekly yoga class, a fact he picked up from overhearing her boast about centering herself during neighborhood gatherings. True to form, at exactly 5:28 p.m., Jake heard the familiar hum of Karen's SUV turning onto their street. His heart raced as he moved to his living room window, pulling back the curtain just enough to watch without being seen. Karen pulled into the cul-de-sac, her car gliding smoothly toward the parking area. She slowed down slightly as she approached the freshly painted fire lane, tilting her head to read the bold lettering. Jake held his breath, wondering if she'd hesitate, or better yet, drive past it altogether. But instead, Karen paused for only a second before shrugging dismissively. Without so much as a second glance, she parked her SUV right where she always did, squarely in the middle of the fire lane. Jake couldn't believe it. Hadn't she seen the signs? Didn't she realize what fire lane, no parking meant? Or maybe she simply didn't care. Either way, her blatant disregard sent a surge of satisfaction coursing through him. This was exactly what he'd hoped for. Now came the best part. watching the consequences unfold. Less than 20 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its lights flashing but sirens silent. Jake's pulse quickened as he watched the officer step out and walk over to Karen's vehicle. The officer examined the scene carefully, taking note of the fire lane markings and snapping photos with his phone. Then he radioed for a tow truck. Within moments, the unmistakable sound of a heavy vehicle approaching echoed through the neighborhood. By now, Karen must have noticed something was wrong. Her front door swung open, and she marched outside, arms crossed and heels clicking against the pavement. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The officer turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. "Ma'am, your vehicle is parked in a designated fire lane. This is a restricted area, and unauthorized vehicles are subject to immediate towing." Karen's face turned bright red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "A fire lane? What are you talking about? This has been my parking spot for months," she sputtered, pointing accusingly at the pavement. The officer raised an eyebrow. "These markings indicate otherwise. Do you have documentation proving this space belongs to you?" Jake stifled a laugh behind his curtains. Of course, Karen didn't have any such proof. It wasn't her spot to begin with. All she could do was splutter and wave her hands dramatically, trying to argue her way out of the situation. But the officer remained unmoved, gesturing for the tow truck driver to proceed. As the crane lifted Karen's SUV off the ground, she threw up her hands in exasperation. "This is ridiculous. Someone will pay for this," she shouted, glaring at the growing crowd of curious neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle. From his vantage point, Jake allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Justice had arrived, and it came with flashing lights and a tow truck. He snapped one last photo of Karen standing helplessly beside the empty space, her jaw clenched in fury. This moment wouldn't just teach her a lesson. It would remind everyone in Willow Ridge that rules exist for a reason, and breaking them comes with consequences. The drama of Karen's SUV being towed away became the talk of Willow Ridge almost instantly. Neighbors who had been quietly observing the parking feud between Jake and Karen for months couldn't help but whisper about what had just unfolded. Some stifled giggles behind closed doors, while others exchanged knowing glances over garden fences. The sight of Karen standing in her driveway, arms crossed and fuming as her car was hauled off, was simply too juicy to ignore. Karen, however, wasn't laughing. She stormed back into her house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Her face burned with humiliation. Not only had she lost her prized parking spot, but now the entire neighborhood knew about it. For someone who prided herself on being the queen of the HOA, this felt like a public takedown. And worse still, she suspected Jake was behind it all. How dare he embarrass her like this? The very next day, Karen marched into the monthly HOA meeting with the kind of energy that made everyone sit up straighter in their chairs. Clutching a stack of papers and wearing her signature scowl, she launched into an impassioned rant. "Someone has vandalized our property," she declared, pointing dramatically at Jake, who sat calmly at the opposite end of the table. "They painted fake signs in the parking area to trick people into thinking it's a fire lane. It's dangerous, deceitful, and completely unacceptable." Jake raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, letting Karen dig herself deeper into her own hole. One by one, other board members turned to him, asking for his side of the story. That's when Jake pulled out his ace, the official permit he'd received from the city planning department. He slid the document across the table, along with photos of the freshly painted fire lane and receipts for the supplies he'd purchased. "I followed every regulation," he explained evenly. "This isn't vandalism, it's compliance. The space is legally designated as a fire lane now, and any unauthorized vehicle parked there will be towed." The room fell silent as the board members reviewed the paperwork. Even Karen seemed momentarily stunned, though she quickly recovered, sputtering objections. But it's *my parking spot," she insisted, her voice rising shrilly. "You can't just change things without consulting the rest of us." Jake leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "Actually, it's not your parking spot. It never was. According to the HOA guidelines, it's always been assigned to me. You've been parking there illegally for months, despite multiple warnings and complaints. If anything, I've shown incredible patience." The board members exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed with Karen's arguments. After a brief discussion, they sided with Jake, confirming that the fire lane designation was legitimate and within the rules. Karen's accusations crumbled under the weight of facts and proper documentation. Defeated, she slumped back in her chair, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. After the meeting, whispers rippled through the neighborhood. Some residents commended Jake for taking a stand, saying it was about time someone stood up to Karen's entitled behavior. Others admitted they'd secretly cheered when her car got towed, tired of her constant nitpicking and rule-bending. For everyone else, at least, a few even joked that Jake should run for president of the HOA, though he politely declined, insisting he preferred staying out of the spotlight. For Karen, the fallout was brutal. Not only did she have to pay a hefty fee to retrieve her SUV from the impound lot, but she also faced quiet ridicule from neighbors who once feared crossing her. Her carefully curated image as the neighborhood enforcer had cracked, revealing the cracks in her own behavior. Over the next few days, she avoided eye contact during walks and kept her curtains drawn tight, clearly avoiding further confrontation. As for Jake, he finally felt a sense of peace returning to his life. Walking past the fire lane each morning, he couldn't help but smile at the bold red letters that had changed everything. What started as a personal battle had become a lesson in fairness, and proof that sometimes standing your ground can lead to justice, even in the most unexpected ways. In the weeks following the infamous fire lane incident, Willow Ridge underwent a subtle but noticeable transformation. The neighborhood, once tense under Karen's self-imposed reign of rules and grievances, seemed to breathe easier. Conversations between neighbors became lighter, friendlier even, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. For years, Karen had cast a long shadow over the community with her constant policing and demands for perfection. But now, her influence waned, leaving space for something more genuine: mutual respect. Karen herself was a changed woman, or at least she tried to appear that way. Gone were the days of strutting around the cul-de-sac with a clipboard, pointing out minor infractions like mismatched curtains or slightly overgrown lawns. Instead, she kept mostly to herself, avoiding eye contact during morning walks and retreating indoors whenever Jake passed by. Her absence from the HOA meetings spoke volumes. No longer did she dominate discussions or insist on micromanaging every detail. Some residents wondered if she'd learned her lesson, while others assumed she was simply licking her wounds after such a public defeat. Jake, on the other hand, found himself enjoying a newfound sense of normalcy. His parking spot, now officially a fire lane, remained untouched, a stark contrast to the months of frustration he'd endured before. Each time he pulled into the space after work, he felt a small thrill of victory. It wasn't just about reclaiming his spot. It was about proving that fairness could prevail when people stood up for themselves in creative ways. He didn't gloat or rub it in Karen's face. Instead, he went about his life quietly, letting the situation speak for itself. The ripple effects of Jake's actions extended beyond their immediate feud. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Karen's temper began asserting their own boundaries. When she complained about someone's trash cans being left out overnight, they politely reminded her that everyone made mistakes, and maybe it was best not to sweat the small stuff. Even the HOA board grew bolder, refusing to indulge her nitpicking complaints and encouraging more collaborative decision-making. Slowly but surely, Karen's grip on the neighborhood loosened. Still, whispers of the fire lane incident lingered. At block parties and casual gatherings, the story resurfaced often, usually accompanied by laughter or nods of approval. "Did you hear what happened to Karen's car?" one neighbor might ask, prompting another to chime in with details. "Good for Jake," someone would inevitably say, raising a glass in mock celebration. Though Jake never sought recognition, he couldn't escape the occasional pat on the back or knowing smile from his peers. Some even joked that he should write a guidebook on dealing with difficult neighbors. For Karen, the aftermath was humbling. She paid dearly, not just financially, thanks to impound fees and towing charges, but socially as well. Friends she thought were loyal distanced themselves, tired of her drama and unwillingness to admit fault. A few brave souls attempted to confront her, gently suggesting that perhaps she'd gone too far this time. "You can't expect to get away with everything forever," one neighbor told her during a rare moment of candor. Karen bristled but said nothing, her silence speaking louder than any rebuttal. Despite the tension, Jake refused to let bitterness take root. He chose forgiveness over resentment, focusing instead on rebuilding harmony within the community. Occasionally, he'd catch glimpses of Karen peeking out her window, watching him with a mix of irritation and curiosity. He wondered if she regretted her actions or if she still harbored resentment. Either way, he decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that peace had returned to Willow Ridge, and that peace started with standing up for what was right. One evening, as Jake sat on his porch sipping coffee, he reflected on how far things had come. The fire lane markings gleamed under the setting sun, a testament to creativity, determination, and justice served. He smiled to himself, knowing that sometimes all it takes is a little ingenuity to turn conflict into resolution and chaos into calm.